approached me to be a part of this dialogue, to really look at how districts and schools are facing today's challenges. So really looking forward to it. Welcome, and we're glad all of you are here.
Thanks so much, Carrie. You always bring so much to the conversations. I'm thrilled that you're here as well. And then, of course, we also have some fabulous panelists that are going to be part of the conversation with us today. So you're going to get to know them in a little bit more time when we introduce them formally. But it's great to have our panelists here as well. So my job right now is, first off, to set some context for this conversation. So to set this conversation in the right context, let's first take a look in that rear view mirror. So one of the reasons that we, of course, are having this conversation today is because in that rear view mirror, as we take a look at that elephant sort of leaning into us, was, of course, what happened in spring 2020. As a result of the COVID pandemic, most schools were closed, their school buildings were closed, and schools had to implement different types of learning formats for that continuity of learning. We saw a situation where what we had as a school format on March 6th suddenly looked very different on May 6th, impacting over 55 million K-12 students across the country. All of this was further supported by that sudden shift to remote e-learning that happened in many schools and districts around the country. Whether you were prepared for that or not, that became your reality very quickly in the spring. Now, there was lots of things that we learned as a result of that experience. So I'm just going to review with you a couple of the things that we've been collecting from school and district leaders over the past 7 months in terms of their lessons learned. Some of those might be different for you, or you may have some additional ones that we want to talk about when we get to that conversation part. So we definitely saw, for example, there was, particularly if you were using technology for your continuity of learning, this shift in the way we were thinking about these digital tools. It wasn't just about student engagement anymore, and suddenly it became the delivery vehicle for education. We also had to think about how to adjust our learning goals and strategies to fit this environment, to fit the situation, to fit the reality that we were facing. In some places, when I talked to folks, their goal initially had been to just replicate what was happening in the classroom online. And in many cases, that was not as successful as they wanted it to be. We also know that in this adjustment period, many folks have also been thinking about, well, what we did in the spring wasn't necessarily a test case for what we want to do in the fall from back to school, but rather it was an experiment to help us be well prepared for the fall. Now, we know that teachers have always differentiated their instructional practices. If you are a second grade teacher, you have a different approach to your content than you might have if you're a 10th grade math teacher. We also know that the needs of students require us to personalize the learning process for them and to adjust the way we approach instruction. Teacher skills come into that, as well as access to resources, including technology in the classroom. We're now, as a result of what happened in the spring and where many of us still are in the fall, are adding another component to this, which is that the classroom setting itself now is having an impact on the way we're thinking about those learning goals and adjusting our instructional practices. So I have some data here. This was collected last school year from about 11,000 teachers nationwide. And one of the things that is interesting about the research data that Project Tomorrow collects is that last year we had the opportunity to look at data before schools closed and then compare it to the experience of that teachers were having while they were in a school shutdown, potentially while they were implementing online learning for their students. So it was very interesting to us to see the increases in the use of digital content as an example of that change in instructional practice during the school closures. So you can see some of the differences here, and we disaggregated this based on the grade level assignment. So for example, we saw that during school closures, 70% of elementary teachers said that they were using some type of an online curriculum, a pretty significant increase from where they had been when they were face-to-face with their students. We also saw that middle school teachers were more likely to be using skill building apps with their students. Their students had mobile devices, so they were taking advantage of that. So it gets into this conversation, brings into this conversation lots of different questions. So are those changes in practice going to be sustained when we are in a face-to-face environment? What do they look like when we're in a hybrid environment? And what did we learn from these experiences that's informing the way we're thinking about virtual learning going forward? What does this all mean in terms of not just the use of digital content, resources, and tools, but what does it really mean in terms of the instructional practices? So with that now, I want to invite our panelists to come into this conversation. And I'll first introduce the three to you, and then Carrie and I have some questions that we're going to set up for them. But of course, if you would like to start putting your questions into the chat box, that'll be great as well. So we have three fabulous panelists with us. Brian Dishman is the Chief Academic Officer for Wayne County Schools in Kentucky. I've had the wonderful pleasure of doing some work recently in Kentucky, and so I am so thrilled that Brian is here with us to share some of his insights. We also have Ben Gilbin, who is with us. Ben is the principal at Warner Elementary School in Western School District in Michigan. Ben also served most recently in the spring on his statewide working group for virtual learning. So Ben has some really interesting insights for us as well. And then our good friend, Brooke Morgan, is here, who is the coordinator of innovative learning within Talladega County Schools in Alabama. Talladega has been a participant in our Speak Up research project over the last couple of years, and it's great to have Brooke here. So welcome to all three, Brian, Ben, and Brooke.
Thank you, Julie.
So let's start off. What I'd like to do is I gave a little bit of a snippet introduction for each one of you, but if you could be so kind, tell us a little bit more about your school or district, and most notably, tell us what your current learning format looks like. Ben, would you like to start?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Hopefully everything's going well in your spot that you're in. I am currently in Michigan, and a couple of things. First off, I'm in a young 5th through 5th grade building. In the district, we have a little over 3,000 students in the district. At Warner Elementary, I'm at roughly 400 students. Our families were given the option, A, they could come back face-to-face 100%, or B, they could be 100% online. We have roughly 80% of students that are face-to-face, which leaves us with 20% that are online. We also have gone one-to-one this year, also with a new LMS. We use Seesaw as our LMS. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about Warner, where I'm located.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, Brian, you're up next.
Good afternoon. Brian Dishman, Chief Academic Officer at Wayne County Schools. Wayne County Schools is a district of about 3,000 students. We're located in the southern part of Kentucky. We have 5 schools, 3 elementary, 1 middle, 1 high school. We're currently operating on a hybrid model, and like Ben's district, our parents had a choice to send their students back to school in person. So currently, the students that are attending in person are attending 2 days per week, and then the other 3 days they learn virtually. And then we also had the choice of 100% virtual learning, and about 30% of our students have taken advantage of that option. So that's where we stand as of today.
Thanks, Brian. And Brooke, give us a little bit of an introduction to Talladega.
Talladega County Schools, we're located in Alabama. We serve approximately 7,200 students in 17 schools. We also offered a full virtual option, and we are currently in a hybrid model. We had about 23% of our students that chose to do virtual 100%. And one thing that's a little different, we are handling our elementary grades a little differently than high school and middle school. When it comes to virtual school, we have live teaching for our elementary students because we just felt it was really important that they have that face-to-face with a teacher, even if it was on Zoom. And we are using Apex for middle and high school, so it's more of a self-paced program. So we have, very marked differences in the different grade bands.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that distinction, Brooke, because I think that's important. One of the things that I have seen in my conversations with school and district leaders all across the country is everybody has a slightly different nuance to this, where it has been responsive to their community's culture, to what the needs are of their community. So Carrie and I are going to share questioning responsibilities here. I'm going to start off. And then Carrie, you'll be up right after me. So my first question is for all three of our panelists, whoever would like to share. Thinking back on the spring, what was one big lesson learned that influenced your thinking when you came back to school in the fall? So what did you carry forward from a reflection that was important for you? Whoever start.
I'll start, Brian. This is Brian. I think the biggest thing for us, there were so many things, but I think the biggest thing that we learned in our district was the necessity of making sure that we stay anchored to the curriculum that we have adopted. When we started in the spring, the state of Kentucky has a non-traditional instruction program, and districts that participate in that program have up to 10 non-traditional instruction days per year to use for weather-related closures or your typical seasonal flu closures. And so we had 10 days worth of materials kind of prepared for that typical NTI scenario. And that was very much built on review and reinforcement of skills, things that students would typically need to work on in that January, February timeframe when those closures would be common. And so when we started with the COVID closure, we'd had a mild winter. We hadn't utilized that program at all. So we started with that basic program. And it just, I guess, helped me to see that you've got to be anchored to the curriculum. You've got to have a starting point, and it becomes about figuring out how to deliver that curriculum in a digital environment. Because without that, it's very easy for you to lose your way with where you're going learning wise. So I think for us, that was something we realized very quickly in March and April. We've got to be planning for the fall for how do we take the curriculum that we have adopted at each grade level and in each subject and adapt that for delivery in a virtual environment.
Thank you, Brian. I agree. That's absolutely essential. And we saw those differences across the country, right? We saw some folks that were only doing enrichment or extra remediation, not necessarily tied to their curriculum formally. Ben?
Well, the entire experience was a learning experience. I should first state that. I would say we learned quite a bit. We learned the need for an LMS. We learned where some of our holes were as when it came to curriculum. But I guess the biggest takeaway from the spring was kind of the confirmation of Maslow over Bloom's, and simply meeting people's basic needs. I can't even begin to tell you the amount of home visits that were done on a weekly basis. I myself, I probably was delivering to over 3 dozen each week. I had several teachers joining me, and I think the biggest takeaway, one of the teachers that I did a home delivery with, she said to me, and I can quote her, I haven't done home visits before, and I now see the value of a home visit for the rest of my career. And that it's a whole nother layer of trust when you can actually be boots on the ground and go right to someone's house to make sure that their basic needs are met. So I think the biggest takeaway for us was truly Maslow over Bloom's.
Isn't that interesting? Thanks so much for sharing that, Ben. And you're absolutely right about that trust factor. That's huge. Mm-hmm. How significant. Brooke, did you have a lesson learned you want to share?
I did. A couple, actually. The first was, we've been one-to-one district for about 8 years. So it was not new that students had a device to take home. But one thing we quickly realized with the constant phone calls requesting paper packets, was that they did not have reliable internet service at home. And, I knew that we had pockets of that, but I think that I realized we had many more homes that even if they did have internet, it was not capable of streaming Zoom consistently and things like that. So I knew that coming back to school, we had to make sure to have a stockpile of hotspots available for those students. And everybody was trying to get hotspots at the same time, as you can imagine. So we actually did not even get them until June, which luckily we had them at the start of this school year. But during that 9 weeks that we were home in March, April, and May, we had to provide paper packets for a lot of households. And so then you had a big difference in learning experiences between the students. So, and also I will say with our teachers, we had, a handful of teachers who loved it. They rocked it out. They were sharing what they were doing on Facebook and Twitter, and they just really got into the groove. And then we had some teachers who had very little experience with Google Classroom. Some had never used it. So there was definitely a learning curve for some of our teachers. And we spent about 2 weeks in August prior to our students returning, just making sure that teachers had the basic skills they needed to run a virtual environment.
Mm-hmm. And I heard similar things across the country. This idea of teacher readiness for the spring was something that in some cases folks knew that it was going to be different. In other cases, it came as a surprise. Thanks for sharing, Brooke. Carrie, do you have a question?
I do have a question. So when each of you introduced yourselves, you gave us a little glimpse of how your districts and schools were leaning into providing choice to your families, whether that was fully virtual, fully face-to-face, or hybrid. I find it fascinating that in all three of your very different districts, 20 to 30% of your families chose a fully online option. But I'd like to kind of lean into that question a little bit more so we can learn at a little bit of a deeper level some of the thinking that went into providing options on learning formats and supporting parent and family need. Let's go in reverse order. Brooke, do you mind if you start?
Sure. So as you can imagine, launching a virtual school in basically a month's time was quite a challenge. And we have a very strong instructional team here at our central office, and we work day and night to create a model that we thought would meet our students' needs. And, we had a lot of discussions about what elementary should look like versus how middle and high school should look. And we were able, with the number of students who actually opted for our Beacon Virtual Academy, we call it BVA, we were able to actually pull some classroom teachers to teach in the BVA Academy. So basically their assignment just changed for the first 9 weeks, and we're going to be reevaluating to decide what type of model we're going to go into in October. So, it was a lot of work, a lot of conversations, and we were kind of trying to decide who we wanted to be those BVA teachers for the elementary schools. And, originally we thought, well, we want the most tech savvy teachers, this, that, and the other. But then we had some situations where some teachers who maybe were not as tech savvy, but they had some health concerns, and they requested to be a BVA teacher because of their fear of working in a classroom of students. So we have provided a lot of support to those teachers, and it's really worked out really well. And one thing that we have seen is a great improvement in parent involvement when it comes to our BVA students. And a first grade teacher told me last week that she was giving them kind of a flash sight word test, and the first grader, they missed a lot of them, and the mother stuck her head in. I thought he knew those. And she said, well, you saw it. And she said the next week he knew every word. And we just laughed about that. But I mean, if you think about in the traditional sense, how many times do we send home a note or even flashcards and say, help your kids with these flashcards? And it was almost like that realization of actually seeing that happen live. They were like, oh, wow, I really do need to help with these words. So we are seeing success stories like that. And then, of course, in middle and high school, that is more self-paced. We have facilitators and we have tutors that they can call in and get assistance from based on the different content areas.
Thank you, Brooke. That's so insightful. And I do hear more and more stories about that kind of support triangle between teacher and family and student. That's wonderful. Ben, can we lean into you?
Absolutely. I'm wanting to pick Brooke's brain more though, because that sounded really great. A few things, as most people are fully aware, and it's already been said a couple of times, but not every family had the devices or the internet service. So one of our biggest challenges from the spring into this year has been the equity piece. How do we provide that that tool that everybody can be on the same level? And so the district, Western School District, where I'm currently at, came up with a model of teachers across the grade level are going to develop baseline lessons, videos, and we were going to be pushing it out through our iPads and through Seesaw. So every student was going to have the same baseline lesson. And then after the baseline lesson, that is where the aim is that we're going to try to meet students exactly where they are. We are limited a little bit with their intervention due to the fact that we had some funding issues from the state, but we're working through that. The positive, I would say, based on your question, the positive is that we do have all of our families on the same LMS. We have all of them getting the same baseline lesson. But then the challenge is that those baseline lessons are, for all intensive purposes, it is more of like a delivery of content. And my own personal opinion is teaching is an art form. And it's not necessarily just about delivering content, it's about the learners right in front of you. And so some of the things that Brooke said, I really want to listen more because she's created that triangle pretty well. And I know for us, one of the challenges is that we want it to be much more than just delivering content. We want it to be about the learners right in front of our teachers so that we can best support them and differentiate. So we are still, for all intents and purposes, a work in progress.
Great answer. I appreciate the kind of transparency with which you're sharing that. And I respect and appreciate and value that you have equity top of mind too. I know that was a big challenge that came out of the spring. Brian, mind sharing about how you kind of arrived at supporting your varying learning formats and parent preferences?
Sure. So our superintendent was pretty adamant from the very beginning that parents needed as much choice as possible. And in fact, our original parent choice model that we rolled out gave parents the option between full virtual, a hybrid or AB schedule, and then also a 4-day per week schedule. And our vision with that was to set aside the Fridays to have no students in the school building so that virtual kids, some who maybe weren't comfortable being there in a full classroom, could come in one-on-one or maybe groups of 2 to 3 to actually get some face time with the teacher. We're still planning to use the Fridays that way. Some things happened in our state with some guidance from our governor and the Department of Public Health that kind of have shifted that plan a little bit. So up to this point, in order to stay in compliance with the state directive, we've not been able to offer that 4-day per week option yet. We're hopeful that we'll be able to do that in the future. So now everybody who has chosen face-to-face is currently on that AB schedule. So really, I think the Fridays, what we're visualizing for that, because this is actually our first week of face-to-face instruction. Our governor had recommended no face-to-face instruction until September 28th. So what we're visualizing as we get on into this more is really using those Fridays to connect with those totally virtual students, bring those families in. We're using Fridays for a meal pickup day for those virtual students. So families come in, they pick up their meals for the entire next week. Our food service staff has been phenomenal, the work that they've done during this time. Give those kids the opportunity to play on the playground. Just stay connected to the culture of the school, because I think that's one of the things that I'm most concerned about is for these months, children being isolated, not having contacts with adults. You know, we live in a rural area where we got a lot of students that live in very difficult circumstances. So leveraging those Fridays for those virtual kids to make sure we can keep at least some face-to-face contact with all of our students, or as many as possible, is an important part of our plan.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, all of these comments have just been, and insights have just been fabulous. Again, I want to underscore, and I'm sure our audience is already there, you all are sharing with us some real practical, pragmatic things about what this experience has been and what it continues to look for. But my hat is off to all of you for the responsiveness to your community, to what the students' needs are. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to pivot here to the next part of our conversation. But first, I know that Carrie, you spend so much time talking to school and district leaders around the country. And thank you for that question for our panel. I'm sure it was informed by some of the work that you've done with schools and districts. Give us a little bit, just not too long, in terms of what you're also seeing out there.
Yeah, it's again very interesting to hear Brooke, Ben, and Brian's perspectives. We are definitely seeing an increase in districts seeking an equitable solution from a digital content provider. So kind of moving beyond what historically was sometimes more of site-based decision-making, to the panelists' point about, getting true to that curriculum they have in place, working with a content provider that can support all students equally across the district as that content provider. We have seen an increase in teachers and students leaning into their individual accounts, and teachers leveraging the ability to create assignments that they can deliver to individual students or small groups of students as they support that equitable instruction, but also simultaneously maintain that critical balance with differentiating for their unique learners. We've worked really closely with lots of districts on kind of tailoring BrainPop as a solution to their custom curriculum. So creating custom curriculum alignments, partnering with them on modifications for synchronous and asynchronous learning, English language developers. And to Ben's point, I'll leave with this. Ben brought up, the critical importance of supporting our kids emotionally and making sure they have a healthy foundation for learning. So as school was starting across the US, we really partnered with districts on making sure they could tap into our social emotional learning topics as well as our digital citizenship topics. Because what we heard from our users was this was so much different than last fall. Last fall, you had classroom norms, community was established, and it was kind of taking those pieces and transitioning to distance learning. Whereas uniquely for back to school, we were trying to create that sense of community and build that foundation for healthy learning to start that new school year. So thanks for asking, Julie. We're seeing lots of neat changes.
It's really interesting. I think we said this early on, we're all still learning, right? This is not all set. There isn't a recipe, there isn't a formula, there isn't a set of policies and procedures. And so we're all learning as we're going forward. One of the things that I know is also really important as part of this learning process is to make sure that we are being responsive to what the needs are of our teachers, particularly in terms of professional development. So I'm going to bring my friend Brenda in to talk about what she's seeing in her districts as well, but thought I would share a little bit with you in terms of some of the data that we collected this year from the spring, comparatively, looking at the professional development needs of teachers and what teachers were saying were their new needs. So what types of professional development did they think they needed? So no surprise here, much greater interest in differentiated learning. How do I do that effectively? Can technology help me with that? The idea of setting up different types of classroom models, blended, flipped learning, What does that mean? Really interesting that 36% of teachers told us in the spring during school closures that they were interested in learning about blended learning. Prior to that, we were only seeing about 17% of elementary teachers that were even considering that. So really interesting in terms of some of those shifts. Also around obviously personalized learning, and that was a lot of the conversation about what Carrie mentioned about aligning the curriculum to individual student needs or taking advantage of student accounts. So we heard that. So what I want to do now, folks, is introduce you to my friend Brenda Hall, who is the Executive Director of the Southern California Professional Development Federation, a really unique organization, collective of school districts that focus in on professional learning and professional development. So welcome, Brenda. And Brenda, why don't you start off, tell us a little bit about SCPDF.
Sure. It's really my privilege to serve as the director for this group. This group was started about 29 years ago by the Dean of the College of Education at California State University, San Marcos. And I see we have one of the directors on the Zoom today, Pat Stahl. But they created this organization along with area superintendents to really work collaboratively K through 16, which I think many of you would agree is somewhat unique. So the group really strives to provide professional learning to help inform the needs of the surrounding districts with regard to pre-service teachers as they come from the university. But really to be collaborative. And I think as we think about this time, many of you talked about the need for ongoing learning and flexibility. And certainly that's part of what we've seen. And because there's an existing structure or group that everyone belongs to, they commit both their time and their money to the group, that they benefit from that collaboration. So it's been really important. And I think we of course didn't foresee this particular time coming, but I think as we've met the challenges over the last 7 months, I think having an opportunity to work with people that they know well and have people they can rely on has been really beneficial.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here today, Brenda. Project Tomorrow has partnered with SCDF for many, many years in terms of sharing out some of our research findings and looking deeply at some of these issues. So Brenda, tell us, so you're working with all these different districts that obviously, as I know, have all different profiles. Some are small, some are very large, some are rural, some are more suburban, all the way across the board. What are you hearing from them in terms of their thoughts about the professional learning that their teachers need at this point?
Mm-hmm. So, and I think from the comments from the earlier panel too, you can see that it's very diverse. One of the things that I'm hearing from the leaders who are trying to support what's happening in the classroom is that it's hard. I think the challenge is great on so many levels, and I know that Ben, Brian, and Brooke can all speak to that in greater depth. But I also think this piece, and Ben really spoke about it, but this idea of relationships and how important they are. So as they're trying to meet the needs of their teachers and provide support, they're at the same time working to communicate really closely and carefully with the community, with the students, their parents, and with their teachers, because their teachers are struggling through this as well. So we have seen a lot of interest in social emotional learning, which some of you have spoken about previously, and really thinking about how can we help build and support our teachers and not add additional stress. And I know, Brooke, you spoke about the fear that some of the teachers have, and that's a real fear that we need to be cognizant of. So that social emotional learning has been really key. I have seen those leaders who have the relationships, those existing relationships, be able to move more quickly. And so I know that we always value and know that, but I think at this particular time, we've seen negotiations with the union, for instance, go much more smoothly when there are some good foundational relationships in place and they can build upon those. So that has been key. Part of my work, honestly, has been a little bit of matchmaking. So people will come to me. There's different issues that arise. Some of them have to do with the grade level, elementary versus secondary and so forth. And they're struggling with questions that they have about maybe it's the master schedule, maybe it's other logistical kinds of issues, and really kind of connecting them with other leaders who are grappling with or who have grappled with some of those same issues. So I think, again, having a community of sorts has been an advantage. All of them have been dealing with PD as it pertains to the learning platforms. So some of you mentioned that as well. I know in one district, they really worked on their learning platform happened to be Canvas, but they really worked with their teachers over the summer so that every teacher at every level would have kind of the same look to their lesson template, so that parents and students were able then to more easily kind of access that information. I think what I've also heard is that they're really looking at continuing some of the good instructional professional development that they were doing before. And Julie, you mentioned that there's a temptation, right, to replicate what we were doing previously. So I think while not doing that, paying attention to, for instance, if they were implementing or working on cognitively guided instruction as an example, that they continued that work over the summer with their teachers, but really talk to them about delivering it in different models. And in the Southern California, San Diego area, we see all different kinds of implementations. We have a number of schools who are completely virtual at this time. We also have a number of schools who've gone back in person, particularly at the elementary level. So I think this idea of being flexible and nimble, and knowing that even if we're back in person today, that could change in a few weeks, depending on what is happening with the virus in the community, has also been really important. So how we can help teachers be flexible and know that they're going to have to move. I think that those that took advantage really of any time off they had in the summer are feeling a little bit better, certainly than they were in March when they had to close down.
So much in there, Brenda. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. You can see why we named this the new nimbleness in teaching, because it is a different mindset. It's also a different mindset, I think, around skills versus capacity. So are we learning particular skills that help us facilitate learning across some new platforms or new formats, or are we actually more focused in on the capacity building to understand what do our teachers need? Now, what I want to do is I want to pull Ben, Brian, and Brooke back into this conversation. And what I'd like to hear from them is, and Brenda did a beautiful job of setting the table for us on this, is what do you see as your needs from your teachers in terms of professional learning? And what are you thinking about in terms of what you're going to be able to provide to your teachers to help them be nimble in this new environment? Ben, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay, so nimble, flexible, yes. I think for me as a building leader, as an educator, I have one lens on the right now, the present, and I always have one lens on the future. Well, right now, there are so many districts around the country that have gone to a new LMS. And if we don't properly train our teachers in how to use that LMS, I feel like we're setting them up for failure. So what I'm hearing from educators around the country, whether it's on Twitter or any type of social media, is the need to bring people up to speed on those tools. Well, as we're bringing people up to speed on those tools, yes, we want them to be able to manage those things, but are we also helping them use those tools to differentiate, to help their practice, to be closer to what we would call best practice? One of the other things along with that is I'm trying to take away barriers. And a barrier that I have noticed is some of our online students, if they lose their password, if they're bogging down a teacher's email, that's not allowing my teachers to do what they do best. And so how can I reduce those barriers? How can I take away some of the things that are restricting them from doing their very best work? So those have been some of the professional development challenges. I'm trying to take away the barriers. I'm trying to get them up to speed on the present, but then I also have to have one lens on the future, because we want to be able to deliver best practice. And right now, in some ways, best practice is taking a little bit of a back seat to social, emotional, and equity pieces, and making sure that everybody's on the same level playing field. I don't necessarily think it has to, but because we're trying to bring everybody up to speed right now, it has taken a bit of a backseat in some places. And so that's also a challenge from leadership. How can we get everybody on the same level playing field, but also be able to differentiate and give them the education that they deserve?
Thank you so much, Ben. That equity lens always has to be a lens, right? We never can put that lens away. So thank you for bringing that back. Brooke or Brian, in terms of the professional learning needs of your teachers?
I'd just like to piggyback off what Ben has said and some of Brenda's comments as well. Trying to find the balance of continuing moving forward with the momentum that we had instructionally, and not letting that take a back seat. And what does it look like to supervise instruction in this environment? That's a question I think we're grappling with really on an almost daily basis. You want to give teachers room to feel comfortable and get used to teaching in this new digital environment. But at the same time, there's a need to also make sure that we're building instructional momentum and moving forward. So we're working on plans right now to kind of get back into making sure we're developing around those content pieces. We actually adopted a new language arts curriculum K through 12 this year, which some people might say we were crazy for going ahead with that. That was in the works when all of this started. But we've got to continue to support that and support that in this digital environment. So that's, I think, where our work is headed over the next little bit. We were maybe lucky that we had been one-to-one at our middle and high school for about 4 years now. We'd been a Google Apps for Education district for about that same period of time. So our staff had a lot of training on that. Of course, some folks maybe hadn't embraced that as much as they could have or should have. And this environment has forced them to do that. So I think that's exciting as well, because this has caused us to take some steps that we probably should have taken already. Now we were at a point where we had no choice but to move in that direction. So going back and filling in those gaps for some things that maybe people should have already known was pretty important as well.
It's such new awareness about what teachers really needed to be able to use these tools effectively.
No place to hide in this digital environment, basically.
That's right. No place to hide. I mentioned before teacher readiness. So we've done a lot of work around teachers' readiness to adopt these new learning models. Well, there we were, right? No time to evaluate teachers' readiness because they needed to be ready at day one. Brian, I think that's so interesting about the different sort of thinking about how to supervise instruction across these new formats. I'm thinking you and I might need to have a further conversation about that. So I'm going to follow up with you. Brooke, some thoughts about the needs of your teachers?
Yes, we are constantly learning. And one thing that we had to kind of back up and start again a couple of times, we had parents who were confused as to where to find their assignments. And, we were using Google Classroom, but in the middle and high school, every teacher had their own Google Classroom, and it was like resources were everywhere. And so we moved to a model where we try to do digital agendas, so that for a grade level, we had like one Google slide, and it columned by the different content areas. It had the Zoom links in there for support. It had links to their iReady, links to whatever program they needed for that certain week. And that has really helped, having all of that in one place, because we were just getting a lot of questions. And another thing that kind of forced was the collaboration among the teachers, because I think initially they weren't really communicating as to what types of things they were doing or planning for at-home learning during that blended model. And so we saw some kids just overwhelmed with the amount of work, and teachers were just trying to get it all in, but they weren't really discussing with one another what one child would be responsible for that week at home. And so we just had to have a lot of conversations like that. And, just what Brian and Ben were saying, we had a lot of superstar teachers when this all happened back in the spring, but we also had those that were lagging behind that just, they didn't need technology because they'd been teaching for so many years and what they did worked. And their hand was really forced, and they really come through learning how to Zoom. And, that's another thing that we are constantly giving tips and tricks to teachers. We have found that, it can be very distracting when you try to Zoom with an entire class. We laugh. We've been watching some of the videos that the teachers do because they record all their lessons and post it so that students and parents can go back and rewatch. But, you would see a cat go across one of the screens, and you would see, older brother making faces in the background and things of that nature. So we've talked to the teachers, you can mute them, you can hide their screen if something like that is distracting. But we are doing a lot of small group Zooms to differentiate, and even one-on-one Zooms in the elementary level. So that's been very effective. So we're just going to continue just giving support as needed. And we're very fortunate to have digital learning coaches in all of our buildings. And so they're working really hard daily with teachers, just at point of need. If they need something, they can send a text or an email, and she can go right to their room and give them assistance as needed, because a lot of times teachers don't know what they don't know until they try to do something and it doesn't work. So that has been a huge piece of our plan.
It's really interesting, Brooke. I know that my friend Carrie is like biting at the bit. She's got a really great question that she wants to ask. But Brooke, I'd love to have you share something that you shared with me when we talked on the phone, which has to do with the hybrid model and what teachers had to realize about setting up 5 days of instructional materials and then being able to overlay that on the hybrid model. So if you could just, because I know Carrie's dying to get her question in, but if you could just give us a little bit of a snippet, because I thought that was a really interesting insight that I hadn't heard from someone else.
Sure. We quickly realized just from feedback from the students, really, that some of the work that had been assigned to them was brand new to them, and they didn't understand how to do it. And especially when it came to math and things like that. And we just really had to talk through it and change our mindset from the typical Monday through Friday week. So our kids that come on Monday and Tuesday, it worked fine for them because they had face-to-face instruction those first 2 days of the week. And then the rest of the week, their virtual assignments were basically for practice, for reinforcement, and that sort of thing. But when you have your Thursday and Friday kids come in and they have the same virtual assignments for that week, then it's all new to them. And a lot of times they weren't completing their work because they didn't understand how to do it. And they would get to school on Thursday and tell the teacher, I tried, but, I didn't know how to do it. And so it's just been, learning together and having teachers realize that I have to think of it as Monday through Friday for my group A students, but Wednesday to Tuesday for my group B students. And it's a mindset change. And it's just a difference in how we plan. And that was a big kind of aha moment for everyone, because teachers liked it really neat. And this is my weekly plan for face-to-face and virtual. And it looks beautiful on paper, but it didn't really translate when Group B was not getting that direct instruction prior to their virtual assignments.
Thanks so much, Brooke, for sharing that. Go ahead,
Oh,
Brenda.
I was just going to add, along with, I know Carrie wants to get in there, but I was going to say that I think what Brooke's reminding us too is the importance of really listening to the students throughout all of this, which I think is so important, and we often, we can't forget that. The other thing I wanted to say is along those same lines too, is that some of the districts that I'm working with are actually tapping into their students to be helping through this. So we have one district who, prior to the school closures, was using students as STAR tech coaches. So they would help teachers with technology in the classroom. Well, they've now put together these students, and they're at the elementary level, put together videos to help people through this process. So, and I've heard some of the same or similar kinds of things with using students as tutors to help other students with the technology or the curriculum, the content itself. So I just think some of these ways can help to empower students and really help them to feel like they're part of the solution. And certainly surveys have been a big part, I think, of what people have been doing. So that's one way we've been listening to, hopefully, to our students, parents, and teachers. And I know we have one person here in particular who's so adept at helping to create surveys and then to analyze data. And Julie has done a lot of that work for us, which we really appreciate. And I can't underscore the importance of that, and then translating all that data into something that's really usable that people can then apply. So anyway, I want to thank Julie, but I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Brenda. Okay.
Oh, very, very good points. So we might just have time to answer, but my question was really related to a drill down around equity and looking at consistency. So Brooke talked about kind of a deep dive of consistency and some strategies they used within the hybrid model, but all three of you are representing places where you're offering multiple learning models right now. And I would anticipate a parent concern about making a choice between those two models. Is my student going to learn at the same quality and depth that they are in the alternative model? So maybe if just one of you would quickly share how you've approached that riddle of consistency as it relates to equity.
Well, I'll share. I think our question as far as that's concerned is, yes, we had three different choices, but and it's three different roadmaps, but the destination on the curriculum is the same. How you get there is what's different. So for example, our kids who are virtual only, we're not trying to replicate the seat time they would get if they were coming to school every day. We're not trying to give them 6 hours worth of stuff to do at home. We're trying to take a much more outcome-based approach. What is it they need to learn? What's the outcome we want? What would serve as evidence of that? Give them some instruction and some tools that they can use to help get there, and then give them a chance to prove mastery. If it takes them 30 minutes to do that, that's great. If it takes them a little bit longer, that's fine too. We can come in with a small group Zoom and help scaffold up for those kids. So I guess in short, it's the destination curriculum wise and outcome wise is the same, but the learning path is different for each of the choices.
Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate it. Thank you. Julie, I'll let you bring us home.
So true, Brian. I'm still thinking about that path, and that really was what we wanted to, was the focus of our conversation here today. You know, so we have these different learning formats, but are we advancing in the same way to what our goals are? Are we addressing those? Folks, we brought in a number of different additional questions, some of which were posed in the chat. So I'm going to move on because we are at the top of the hour. I did want to leave you with a couple other resources. For one thing, as I mentioned before, we have recorded this. We are going to send this all out to you. Please feel free to share this with your colleagues and other folks that you work with. In addition, I'd love to have you come and visit us at tomorrow.org. We have quite a collection of research-based reports and infographics around a wide range of different topics. I mentioned in addition to the recording, we also are doing an executive white paper on this topic. And so you'll be the first ones to receive it. We will be pre-releasing it to you next week. So you'll get a copy of that from us. It's going to include some research work that we've done around this topic of differentiating learning across the different formats, as well as bring in some of the insights of our panelists here today. And then also, if you have not already are familiar with this, every year Project Tomorrow does a congressional briefing where we brief Congress and the education associations and many of the different federal agencies and state agencies about the research work that we have to inform their policies and programs. This year, for the first time, we're going virtual, which we're super excited about because we're going to have the opportunity to have a panel of students that are going to talk about their views on these subjects from all across the country. So I am hoping that you will join us on Wednesday, October 21st for our virtual congressional briefing, where we'll be sharing the very latest results, but most importantly, as Brenda underscored, listening to our students as well. So folks, I want to thank my fabulous co-moderator, Carrie Stubbs, for joining me here today. Carrie, thank you so very much. And our fabulous panel, Ben, Brian, Brenda, and Brooke, for sharing their insights. Brenda and I had a conversation yesterday. I think all of my go forward webinars, I'm only going to have panelists that have names that start with the same letter. So this was the B group. My next webinar will be all folks with maybe a different letter. Consistent. It's just a new way of doing webinars. Let's call it that. I want to thank the Project Tomorrow team that has supported us here today and all of you that have joined us. This is a really important conversation. And so I am so thrilled that you had the opportunity to come and listen to our panelists, maybe gain some new ideas and some insights. Keep up the good work out there, folks. We are rooting for all of you. So keep on this path and please let us know if there's some way that we can help you as well. So with that, folks, we will close out for today. Thank you again to everyone for joining us.
Bye-bye.